Well, my name is Peggy Billings, and I'm the aunt. I never thought I would have a privilege like this, or a responsibility like this, but here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are we going to do?
Yeah. I have lived with David through all of the events that he is writing about and helping us understand. Some of them really close up, and some at a more of a distance. In fact, I learned some things about my family from reading the book, and learned some things about David that he never was willing to admit before.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's in there.
I know.
And so it's a privilege to introduce him tonight. I saw him first, of course, as a wee lad when he got born in Macomb, Mississippi, and then sitting in diapers. You didn't know you did that, did you? Sitting in diapers on the step of the house where he was born, and sharing all of that part of his life with him, which he didn't know anything about. But then as he came to consciousness and came to involvement in the issues which have shaped his life, I have joined with him as an adult and as someone who carries the same concerns and the same commitments and the same love of people and the same love of justice. His particular journey is amazing to me, and I'm as happy to be here as you can imagine, to see him on this road now. On the road, stay on it.
I am.
As you say in the book, what is it? Don't get beyond your raising.
Don't get beyond
Just
your
don't
race.
get beyond your raising.
I'll get you in trouble every now and then. Deep Denial. It's my first book, and I had been encouraged to write. I work with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and for many years, almost 40 now, I have been talking about the undoing of racism. And there are a lot of you who have histories in that, and some of you have impacted my life. And so I'm very glad to be here in Ithaca once again. I was coming up regularly a few years ago, working with the school system and, that sort of thing, and getting to know Roberta Wallet and other radicals here in Ithaca. But it's a great pleasure to be here and to write Deep Denial, which I didn't mean for it to come out almost simultaneously with the events of the day, I thought I would have to convince people of the urgency of understanding white supremacy from the way that I am writing about it. But alas, last Tuesday happened, and here we are one week away. I wanted to talk about internalized superiority. That's what I became fascinated with. What were the messages? Each decade of my life, I'd tell a story, and then I would say, this is my story, this is what was going on in the nation at the time. So I would try to cull from that. What were the messages that I was receiving? Even as I grew politically and said, well, I don't believe that, I still heard the messages, and they were somewhere inside of me. and as it is in all of the lives of those of us who are called white in this country. And so I wrote Deep Denial, because for me, white supremacy is not the hate groups. That's an aspect of it. The groups like the Klan and the skinheads and all of that sort of thing that we hear about. But my premise is that we who are white, and in what Marjorie Freeman calls the knowing class. It is the knowing class that says, if asked, what are we going to do about racism? Or are you, people say, well, I'm against racism. But then most of us don't do anything about it. We're just against it. Last Tuesday, once again, we got out-organized. That right wing was organizing to the last second. And it had started 8 years before. And it was like a train approaching that some of us didn't see coming, and were surprised and shocked by the outcome. I know that in large measure I was, but the idea is that white supremacy is not just those hate groups and what we call right wing. It's those of us in academia. It's those of us in the professional classes. It's those of us who decide the curriculums in this country and what role race plays in it. So it's that deep denial, or what I call deep denial, that we were sleepwalking as a nation, and we got creamed. And so that's what I'm writing about. In everybody's life, certainly mine and certainly yours, there are those who have a lifetime impact on us. And Peggy Billings is one of those persons for me. I didn't know Peggy most of her early years because I was growing up in Mississippi and in Arkansas. But I would hear about her, and then it would seep through. And I knew that Peggy was involved in something called civil rights. And I thought, well, what is that? For me, civil rights was the 6 o'clock news. I would watch it. I would see what the rest of the world was doing. And I knew that sort of information was not reaching people like me. So I would grow up most wanting to get out of Mississippi and move to New York City. That was the Gold Coast for me, That's where Peggy lived. That's where she was doing her work. Ironically, 6 years ago, I moved from New York City back to Macomb, Mississippi. I said, well, you need to end up where you started out. I don't know if that was the right thing to do, Marjorie and I look at each other at least once a week and say, did we do the right thing? It's hard down there. It's a beautiful place to live, but the politics and the meanness is still there. The people see in Macomb, other whites like me, they'll say, well, we've moved so far. And I say, well, the fact that we're not bombing churches and setting people on, that's a rather low bar, Hopefully we've gone beyond that, but the struggle continues. So what I did, and I want to read you an excerpt from it, was try to look at those moments, those situations that impacted my life and those around me, and that I learned from and love very much. And yet, it was and is a white supremacist society that we're living in. A lot of us would say, well, I don't agree with that, but you live it, And so that's what I tried to do with this book. And Marjorie says, you always talk, you don't read the story, so I'm going to read it. I always think I talk too slow, so by the time I read this story, they'll all be home, but let me try. On January 4th, 1962, my Uncle Harry was murdered in Macomb, Mississippi, Peggy's brother. The murder was brutal and senseless, and it tore my family apart, and also the family of the young man who killed him. Their lives were immediately in danger. It set off a wave of violence and revenge-seeking in town. We were living by then in Helena, Arkansas, and I remember when my father left the room to answer the phone and receive the news about Uncle Harry. He was quiet, but clearly shaken when he told us the news and immediately retreated to the bathroom. He was in there for hours. My memory was that he stayed in there most of the day. I don't really know how long he stayed, but it was an eternity to me. My life would never be the same. My father would never be the same either. He was always reserved and self-contained to the point of seeming distant and aloof. He would be even more so after Uncle Harry's murder. More than anything, I remember the ride down to Macomb after Uncle Harry's murder. The trip to Macomb from Helena was some 300 miles of silence. 5 of us, 2 of my 3 sisters, myself, my mother, and my father. 300 miles of grim-faced grief, broken only by the sounds of the radio. I remember Marty Robbins' hit song, El Paso, #1 in the country charts. It played over and over. My father never spoke. He stared grimly ahead. My mother shushed us from time to time. My uncle, his brother, had been killed by a black man. The murderer was a young man, 17 or so. That's how I remember it, 1 year older than I was. In another time and place, we might have been in high school together. We might have played football and gone on to Ole Miss, but not in 1962 and not in Macomb, Mississippi. Willie Lee Anderson would pay the price of that act not much more than a year later. On the night we arrived, 1 day after Harry was killed, Willie Lee Anderson was already in state custody, bound over. He was caught with blood still on his hands. He had not even bothered to run. He was apprehended in his own home with his mother. Harry Billings was dead. Willie Lee Anderson was caught, and Macomb was gripped with racial frenzy. The Klan came. They wore no sheets. They didn't need to. They made no attempt to disguise themselves. I recognized some of the names, some of the voices. From the anteroom where I was to sleep, I listened as they talked to my father and my uncles on the possibilities. Do you want us to burn them out? He said no. I remember the silence. 6 Billings brothers remained. 2 sisters remained. Who would speak? I was terrified. I thought it could go either way. I think it was James, my Uncle James, who answered. James was not the oldest, but he was a war hero. He had seen death, and he had seen destruction. And eventually, James spoke. He says, "That's not what we want. We are not that kind of family. It won't bring Harry back. It's not his mother's fault. We are not that kind of family." I gasped because I genuinely was not sure what kind of family were we. Where did we stand? In many ways, we were typical white Southerners, brought up when white supremacy was a given. In fact, it was the law. Mississippi had a sovereignty commission. You could commit treason against the state. Every aspect of our lives was controlled by this ideology. We're not that kind of family. I wasn't sure. I was scared. What kind of family were we in Memphis, in Mississippi, in 1961? We were white, we were Southern, we were Christian, die-hard segregationist, racist. We were normal. Like everybody else that I knew at the time, in Macomb, 1962, Brenda Travis and Ike Lewis would lead a walkout from the Black High School 2 miles through downtown to City Hall. It was a courageous act on their part. It was the year that Bob Moses would locate to Macomb the first time, upon invitation for C.C. Bryant and E.W. Steptoe, Herbert Lee, Bobby Talbot, Curtis Hayes Muhammad, Hollis Watkins. Many others would begin planning for a voter registration drive, and Freedom House would be opened. Herbert Lee would later be killed, become one of Mississippi's early civil rights martyrs. He would not be the last. Churches would be burned by night riders. Macomb would be known ignominiously for a while as the church burning capital of the world. But I didn't know anything about it. Bob Moses, Brenda Travis, Ike Lewis, Aline Quinn, Herbert Lee, Curtis Hayes, Hollis Watkins would be names I would later learn about, and some I would learn from, but at the time they had no names, only epithets. Agitators, outside agitators. It's all I ever heard, although not at home. My parents didn't talk that way. Troublemakers, not martyrs. This is what they were. Looking back, there were many martyrs. Maybe Harry Billings and Willie Lee Anderson were martyrs too, in that twisted time and place. What kind of family were we? We were churched. My aunt was a missionary, recently returned from Korea, then working in New York City. One of my uncles had gone to seminary in Atlanta. Another was a church leader in Memphis. All of us were Baptists or Methodists or somewhere in between. At the funeral, Harry's favorite hymn, The Old Rugged Cross, was sung. I had never heard, then nor since, such piercing grief, wails of grief, and sadness and pain. Did Willie Lee Anderson go to church? I bet he did. I didn't know. The old rugged cross, a symbol of suffering and shame. It burned bright that winter of 1962, in front yards sometimes, in cow pastures, in church sanctuaries, for a world of lost sinners and was slain. Yes, Lord, like Herbert and Harry and Willie Lee and me. What kind of family were we? We were a walking set of contradictions, as the Temptations would say. My mother took me aside, and not long after it happened, we never had long talks about it. Her references were often oblique. David, she would say, there are a lot of things in this life we can't begin to understand, but I don't want you to lose faith. God has a way of making sense out of these things, she said. Your father's very hurt, but he loves you very much. Be patient with him. From 1962 to this day, I carry the memories, the contradictions inside of me, as much a part of my life as life itself. The old rugged cross, Jesus' cross, the Klan's cross, a symbol of suffering and shame. Time passes in spite of itself. In October 1962, the Russians approached Cuba. James Meredith entered Ole Miss. I did too in 1964. With my suitcase of contradictions, I watched as the first black women students on campus had snowballs hurled at them to the point that they were knocked to their knees. I watched as a panty raid prior to the LSU game turned violent, and all the black students were evacuated from campus. I watched as the first black athlete, a Tulane baseball player, stood silent in left field as the crowd chanted out, N-I-G-G, and you finished the rest, and cheered when a ball went through his shaking legs. And I listened to the silence as Houston's Warren McVeigh that fall returned a punt for a touchdown. Barriers were being broken, quickly repaired. I was at Ole Miss. Where was Willie Lee Anderson? Willie Lee Anderson was dead. In June of 1963, he was put to death in Mississippi's gas chamber. A small clipping in the Jackson and Macomb newspapers was all there was. In the larger scheme of things, I guess it was no big deal, but it was for the Billings family, and surely for the Anderson family. It read quite simply that Willie Lee Anderson, Negro male, convicted of the murder of Harry Billings in Macomb, January 62, was to be put to death. Willie Lee had been in Parchman prison little more than a year while I was still in high school. We were two young Southerners who had grown up near each other, partly in the same town, yet we were worlds apart. The murder of my uncle and the execution of Willie Lee Anderson were the turning points in my life and ministry. I would never forget them. From that day on, I began anti-racist work that would take me all over the United States, different parts of the world. What kind of family were we? I don't know. Still don't. We were, still are, full of contradictions. Later, I would be sentenced to Parchman, but that's another chapter in the story. Did I ever forgive him for murdering my uncle? I don't know. As a Christian, I was supposed to, but one thing was for certain. I never forgot it. I played Willie Lee Anderson's death over and over in my mind. Times that I began to imagine. I went to his appeal hearing and asked that the killing stop. I never did. I live with the contradictions. I still do. What? We are not that kind of family. This is what Uncle James said. I guess we weren't. I owe that to Harry. In a strange way, I guess I owe it to Willie Lee too. After that experience, I was 16, I began to try to understand what was this race thing all about? Why such hatred? Why such brutality? What was it? You know, I started studying. Why was I called white? What was white? When we became white, what was our ethnicity? I didn't know. I was always white, you know. I didn't know our ethnicity. But I would try to learn, what was this race-constructed society all about? As I would travel the country, it might not be as bad as Macomb, Mississippi in 1962, but racism is not a product of the South. It was part of the nation's fabric. It was everywhere. The learned classes, what we learned and who taught us and all of that were part of the deafening silence that we live with in this country. Racism is always somebody else. White supremacy is someone down the road. And yet, it was all of us, not just in the South, not just in Mississippi, but all over the United States. So, you know, I've been at it. I'm 70 now. Oh, my goodness, you know, getting older. Don't have the energy I once did. Leave the organizing downtown, a wonderful demonstration that's going on as we speak, in Ithaca. It's why the young people lead the movements. Because if you ask me today, well, why don't you spend the evening with us bringing down the barricades? I thought, I just can't do it. Too tired, Here, let me write a check, something. And that's why the young people lead the movements in this world and in this country. This book is my effort to explain those things. I'll go to the back of the book. Last chapter. By 1965, I had joined the movement. I don't know who knew that besides me, but I was on board. I had just enrolled at Ole Miss, and while I still followed its sports teams, I was very aware that James Meredith had just left. His presence was felt everywhere, as though he were still on campus, which felt like it could explode at any moment. I heard outrageous stories about how the Army personnel assigned to protect him were treated. Students, as they went in and out of any building, were subject to search, especially in the dormitories near Baxter Hall, where Meredith himself lived alone. Pillowcases stuffed with razor blades, feces, and soaked with all manner of things exploded on the walls of his dorm. Cherry bombs were tossed on Baxter Hall's roof, and at all hours of the night, unrelenting racist cat calls threatened his life. I was told this was mild compared to what he had endured his first months on campus. I was aware that Medgar Evers, the charismatic head of the NAACP in Mississippi, who was often compared to Dr. King, had been ambushed and killed in 1963 by a Klansman named Byron Della Beckwith. Even though Beckwith's high-powered weapon was left at the scene, his thumbprint on the telegraphic site, and with his thumbprint on it, and even though others testified that Beckwith boasted about shooting Evers, Beckwith was nonetheless not convicted of the shooting. That was nothing new. No white man had ever been convicted of killing a black man in Mississippi. It would be 30 years before Beckwith was convicted of killing Medgar Evers. Now in 1968, his brother Charles was running for Congress. Most people in Mississippi, white and black, thought his campaign was a suicide mission, given the number of Mississippi murders of civil rights workers in just the 3 years prior to Evers' announcement of his candidacy. There was ample reason to believe it true. This was my chance to get my feet wet, as they said. I could become a volunteer for the Evers campaign, get my first taste of the movement. I could become a civil rights worker. I was just 23 years old, and I was ready. I don't know what I expected this experience to be. I think I envisioned it as some type of pep rally, like before football games. My friend and classmate David Malpas had told me about Evers, what his election would mean to Mississippi. Malpas was from the Delta like I was. His father was a minister in Belzoni and one of the pastors who signed the 1965 Declaration of Conscience, calling for an end to hatred and violence. He was forced to resign his pastorate as a result, but back to me. I certainly did not expect to be assigned to the white section of town. My job was to go door to door and pass out Charles Evers for Congress leaflets and engage those whites who so chose to be in a conversation about Evers' platform. None chose to. This was democracy in its rawest form. I was spat upon, chased away by someone who told me to wait right where I was till he got his shotgun. You know what I did? I waited, He was an elder, and I thought, wait a minute, shotgun, I'm getting out of here. Speaking to other white people about race and racism is the most difficult task one can take on as a white anti-racist organizer. There are many reasons for this. The sense of individuality among whites make it easy for us to deny anything that might otherwise incriminate us when it comes to race. Another challenge is our definition of racism is usually confined to individual acts of meanness or overt prejudice. Many of us whites have not been exposed to understanding of the institutional and systemic nature of racism. We are stuck in the individual dynamics of race. In fact, no small number of us feel black people are not only racist towards white people, but enjoy privileges and access to power that whites no longer have. Sound familiar? The angry white person that supposedly spoke out with a vengeance last Tuesday. It's always been there. Always been this anger. Always this close to, going into violence. This idea, this is what I didn't want to do. I did not want to separate myself from that reality. I did not want to say I was an exceptional white person. I was different. I wasn't any different at all. I was just fortunate enough to have some mentors and to be in a certain time and place that would send me down one road, but it could just have easily been another. So that when my brother-in-law, married to Marjorie's sister, he said, well, if you're going to write that book, tell the truth. He says, don't separate yourself. So I attempted to tell the truth. And as I said earlier, there are things in my past that I'm not proud of, things I participated in that I would rather not have done. And yet, if to tell the truth, I got to tell that, So that's why I wrote the book, And those of you who can read it and get something out of it, I'd appreciate it. Those of you who don't like it, keep it to yourself. No. We live in, I don't have to tell you, the times, the pendulum that Dr. King said always moves towards justice, but it swings back. Every time in this nation, in our history as a nation, that we have made progress on what we call the race question, there's a counterattack. There's a blowback that puts us back closer to where we are than the United States that we might envision. What is this? This racial dynamic that just grips us as a nation. And it doesn't matter where you live. I lived in New York. Margie and I went up there to the city because you know how at conferences people say, well, we'd love to have one of y'all come up and do whatever. And someone would say, oh, yeah, we'd love to do that. I didn't think it would last any longer than the flight back home. But in fact, it did. And we moved to New York City again in 2004. When we started the workshops in the schools of social work, a lot of really intelligent people, moral people, activists around issues of oppression, they felt like the racism was a product of the South. Oh, y'all stupid. They didn't say that. Crackers, ill-educated, something wrong with you. I said, really? New York City got one of the ugliest histories in this nation when it comes to race. And yet there was this denial. That was somebody else, you know. I said, we could never get away with some of the things that you do here in New York City, you know. But there was a distance from it. That was somebody else. This was us. So I've never been anywhere. I've been most places in the United States. Some of you are world travelers. But this ugliness of race raises its head anywhere you are in the United States. And yet, we are not up in arms about it, or, you know, we're not outraged by it. Last Tuesday night, we got once again a reminder that we are always this close to blowing up as a society. Sometimes literally, other times emotionally. And we've got to fight, not bemoan it, but organize. Be as determined that when 2020 comes around, that we're going to be as ready as those who just took over the United States. You can't educate racism away. Some of us try. We major in, you know, black studies, white studies, you know. But it's more than that. You know, you can't legislate it away. You've got to organize. You've got to face the power. You've got to stand up and say, no more in our name. No more in our name. Yes, sir.
Talk to upstate New York liberal white community about internalized white supremacy and institutionalized racism in our country.
Yes. And we deny it. You know, we say, that's not me. When you think about it, only people of color, only white people are allowed to be individuals. This is how white supremacy is kept in place. I'm just me. I'm David, you know. And very early in the workshop, someone said, don't you have a people? Who are you from? Who are your parents? You're more than just David, you know. People of color always dealt with this as a collective. Now put us on the same job together. Some of us living a life of collectivity, meaning if one person does something wrong, you all did. It's exactly the opposite for those of us who are white. You know, I don't have to be held accountable for any of the heinous acts of white people in this country. It's not a part of my mindset. But there's not a person of color in the United States, in my opinion and in my experience, who when something drastic happens, you know, they don't say, I hope it wasn't one of us. You know, and they show a white person, collective sigh, whew, you know, and that's it. This white supremacy is by a lot of things, and part of it is this individuality, which means that we can't be held accountable.
What do people in your area, Mississippi, how do they respond to your book?
The actual book release party was surprisingly warm and proud. Someone from Macomb had written a book about these issues. It wasn't always that way. You know, it certainly wasn't. Can I tell a story about you, Peggy? All right. There was a time during the height of civil rights, Dr. King was, you know, he was called every epithet you can imagine. Never a respect. You don't call him Dr. King, not Reverend. You cursed him, you know, to the point that after Selma, where Peggy was, the preacher of the local Methodist church came to my Uncle Cliff and said, don't you think Peggy would be a lot happier if she moved her letter from our local United Methodist Church, that was your membership, your letter, and joined a church in New York City, wouldn't it be nice if she was taken off the rolls? And my Uncle Cliff said, I'm sure she would be happier. And while you're at it, take the rest of us off of that list too. You know, that's the best side of us. That side that believes that family, you know, is so vital. And that regardless of our differences, you got to stay together. These were the events, you know, that gave me hope. Uncle Cliff signed that letter of consciousness. I didn't know that. He never said. You know, I wanted to say, well, speak up, you know. But he did. And I didn't learn about it until I was, almost 60 years old. So the hopefulness that I bring from all of this, people of color have known this. You've lived through worse. You know, Donald Trump, just the latest, you know. But people like myself, it seems like the end of the world. And maybe we won't live to see someone other than a Trump be president of the United States. I don't know. You know, it just says we got a lot of work to do. Anybody else? Yes.
You said that education doesn't work, and it seems like maybe that's true, and that we need to organize. And so I guess I'm just wondering, how do we organize if we can't engage with a huge portion of our population?
That's right. And we have, we don't, most of us, a lot of us, not all of us, we don't know those white people, you know, that in the way that gives us the right or the access to what they're thinking. It's very difficult to do. You have to build a lot of relationships so that that love and that family begins to kick in. But still, it's very difficult because we are not in the same spaces a lot of times, you know. So the way I've seen it work, and some of you here would have better examples than I do around it, is often with the young people. You know, the model, if you look at this book, anybody can write about what they were experiencing in a certain moment in time. And then to be able to say, okay, what was going on in the nation that made you conscious of that? You know, it's a good teaching tool. It was for me, you know, because I struggled with various renditions of this book, and I finally latched on that. And I said, okay, I can talk with some assurance about that. And it was helpful. So, you know, for those who are asked, write your story. Tell your story. Don't worry about how it sounds to others. Tell your story. And then say, what are some of the messages, you know, that you were receiving as you moved your life along? I think it's helpful because it gets us beyond the tenseness of the moment, the inability or the unwillingness to interact with each other. And so, you know, I recommend it. That's what I try to do when I'm with young people, which is not a lot anymore. I used to do a lot more work in that field than I do now. My father, to tell another story about him, he was a World War II veteran, and D-Day came around, the celebration. I think it was the 50th anniversary. And my niece invited him to the high school to talk about D-Day. And he agreed. I was scared. I said, oh, man, you know, how will he be treated? What will he say? You know, how will that be accepted? He was older, much older by that time. He talked slow. He still used the language of the past. I was afraid of him. I went back to New Orleans, you know. Came back. I said, Daddy, how'd it go? He said, I think it went pretty well. I said, well, why? What'd you do? He said, I told him about the Red Ball Express. So I said, what was that? He said it was a battalion of colored troops. That's how he talked. He said they were sent in to break the German resistance. And then he stopped. He said, you know, they took many casualties. And then he said something that I never forgot again. He said, we couldn't have won the war without them. I thought, damn, Daddy, go ahead. You know, in that sentence, I think he had traveled a much longer road than I had, although I was getting accolades for it. He was just an older man sitting on his front porch, but by able to say that and to view it, not couch it, was a tremendous testimony, I thought. And he continued to do things like that as he grew older. My mother was quiet strength. You know, she would take me aside. She would talk to me. She would unpack the Christian scriptures. And she would always do it without any judgment, but always saying to me, don't lose contact. That's why I have that phrase in there. Don't go beyond your raising. You know, don't look down on your people. Come back home. I had a mentor with the People's Institute. He was much younger than me. He had helped found the Black Studies Department in northern Kentucky. We were doing a work in Mississippi Gulf Coast. He said, don't your parents live near here? I said, yeah. I knew what he was going to say, you know. He said, you're going to go see them, right? I said, well, you know, I don't know. My parents are kind of racist. He said, let me get this straight. You can work with our parents. You can love them no matter what they do. You can work with our children, but you can't go back home with your parents because you think they're racist. And he said, get your ass home. Reconcile. Then come back. Then maybe we'll let you continue to work with us. You know, and, you know, I never forgot that. All these mentors. I think that there are really positive things going on. I think Black Lives Matter is a powerful tool. You can tell it is when the dominant culture tries to discredit it so quickly. Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you did with the school district here?
It was a highlight of my life. I was invited by some folk, and it's how I met Roberta and others, to talk to them about what I've been talking to you about. What is the race-constructed nation? How did it happen? To whom did it happen? Why? How did those of us of European descent who had these violent histories with each other in this country melded into being white people? And I was asked to come and talk to the assembled teachers and administrators, and they really were quite supportive, and I kept coming back month after month to work with people in the school system and to talk about the need that we have to organize and how teachers and administrators have played such a role in this nation's history in regard to organizing, you know. So I would do workshops with them. I do book readings with them. So what do we read? I said, read Where Do We Go From Here by Martin Luther King. But they ran with it. And there were many examples of people taking the initiative. Not all the problems, are eradicated. I told one of my close friends from here, who was the person who invited me the first time, I said, this is going to get you fired. He said, oh no, not here. A few years later, she was gone, because that's the history. You get too close, you're getting rid of, and so you have to watch it. You have to build a base. You have to get people around you. But that's what I did. Would you, Roberta, is that more or less what I did?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about one of the things that happened, a group of us teachers who went through the first series of workshops together. And after the workshops were over, we decided to continue meeting together. And we met once a month for about a year, I think. We called ourselves Urgent. The first two letters being undoing racism, but expressing the urgency. And we decided as a group that what we wanted to focus on was having a greater proportion of teachers of color in the school district, because it's a huge disproportionality between the number of children of color and the number of staff of color. And so we worked on that for a full year. So that was 16 years ago, maybe. And I must say, I'm retired now, but I am still working on that. And it is still not happening. And it would be wonderful for people to give us support and let the administration know that this is a really important thing to the community, because it's important for children of color to see somebody that looks like them up in front of the classroom, and it is equally important for white children to see a person of color up in front of the classroom.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody.